Well, welcome back, everybody.
Welcome to our backyard.
Welcome to our backyard, back to our backyard.
Yeah.
So in our final session today, we're going to go back to where we started. And we're going to, of course, return to the story of the road to Emmaus, which we're using as our sort of umbrella for all the things we want to talk to you about today. And today we want to focus on a particular aspect of the story that we haven't really hit on too much. We mentioned it, I think, in the first session.
Yeah.
We want to come back to that. But it has to do with not just what Jesus does with these two disciples, this husband and wife, Mary and Cleopas, who are walking away from Jerusalem, but we want to talk about what's going on inside of them. We want to talk about the way in which we've definitely felt a connection to these two and what they might be dealing with, and maybe you have as well. So in the story, you know, we don't know much about these two. We don't know much about Mary and Cleopas. We know the names, perhaps. We know that they were disciples, which meant they were followers of Jesus. We don't know where they've come from. We don't know how long they've been following. We don't know if they've sacrificed something, quit jobs, left family, friends to go after Jesus. We don't know. All we know is the second half of the story, that now they're disappointed by whatever it is they thought they were following. They had hoped. They said when they're on the road, walking away from Jerusalem, walking away from the church, having been disappointed, having been let down, they say to Jesus, who accompanies them, who walks with them, we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. In other words, we don't hope that anymore. We've been let down, and now we're walking away and we're thrown in the towel.
Yeah, that part of the story, I think, is so impactful, and in a way it's almost haunting that I think all of us are tempted in our married lives and in our journeys and our vocational journeys to say, wow, this is really hard. I don't know if I can do this. And maybe you haven't hit that point yet in your vocational journey, and that's okay too. That's great, actually. But I just want to acknowledge that suffering is real, and our response to it is very human. And their response is very human, to be like, well, all right, we had hoped these things, we don't hope them anymore, and off we go. So, and then of course that's not the end of the story, thank God. But we want to share a little bit about our story, and I hope that you can see it in the context of your own story. I want you all after this to talk about your own story, where God has entered in and what you had hoped for that you don't have that hope for anymore.
Or maybe it looked a little bit different than you thought it was going to look.
Right. And so I want to share a little bit about our adoption story and our story as a family, okay? So when we said I do, we had an image in our mind of everything we thought our life would look like. And I don't think either one of us was like, it has to look like this, but it's natural to daydream. It's natural as a young, idealistic, married couple to think about what your life will look like.
We all have expectations.
And we all have expectations. So when we said I do, we definitely wanted children. I wanted a life of adventure. We had this dream of starting this Catholic summer camp, all of these hopes and dreams that we had, dreams for travel, hopes and dreams. So when we started our married journey, we were open to life, and we weren't upset or worried that we weren't pregnant at any point, because we just figured it was some medical things, some things I knew about myself that would probably delay our pregnancy, and maybe we would even have to go to a doctor and get some things figured out. So I wasn't too worried. So we were living out our life. Both of us were in grad school. Both of us were chasing after the dreams that we had, and that was a good thing. We weren't too worried that we weren't getting pregnant. But then there came a point where, despite not worrying, despite not being too concerned about the timeline, I was on a wilderness backpacking trip. It was the capstone project for my graduate school. I studied adventure education, and it was an instructor course, a backpacking instructor course. So it was on this 14-day wilderness trip. We had not talked once in that 14 days. And I felt God really calling us, truly calling us to adoption. And I thought, well, really, Lord? What about this? What about that? And it just was so clear. It was so clear we were being called to adoption. So I come home, and I tell Scott, who had surprised me by painting all of these bedrooms in our
It was boring
townhouse.
without her around.
And what did you say to me?
I remember the moment that I was standing on a ladder, painting a really high portion of our bedroom wall, and I was just absolutely struck by this idea that we should think about adoption. We should pursue this. And I remember I actually had the TV on in the background, and the weather report was on, and they were talking about these huge thunderstorms that were happening down in this mountain range in southern Colorado, which was exactly where Annie was, which is how we kind of pinpointed that we were thinking these things about the same exact time.
Right. And that was so powerful to me. So we started moving forward in that journey. We opened the computer and looked at how much adoption costs, and we were two missionaries just rubbing a couple pennies together
So we
to
closed
make
the
it work. So we
computer
closed the
quickly
computer
and
and said, okay, well, clearly
there's no
we're
way.
wrong. Clearly, there's no way, or God is just going to keep showing us the way. But it seemed like at that moment there wasn't even an option. So we continue to go about our graduate school lives and work lives and missionary lives. And the burning just got more intense. And it wasn't something we could just keep going on with our lives and not address. So Scott had reached out to some friends who had adopted. And the next day, they're like, Scott, we got to take you out to lunch, right? And he said, there's this person in our lives who's housing a 15-year-old girl. She's pregnant, and they're looking for a couple to adopt their baby. So of course we're thinking, this is amazing, this is crazy, how amazing.
But it's too much.
But it's too much.
We
right?
thought, this can't be us. People wait
Yeah.
for years
Right.
for adoption. We barely have the thought.
Right.
And now all of a sudden these pieces are falling into place, and it scared us.
Right. And so we actually said, it couldn't possibly be us. People are waiting for years and years and years for adoption. Who are we to utter the word adoption and be chosen? I mean, we weren't technically chosen yet. We were asked to meet a birth mother. But I was overwhelmed with guilt and doubt. And so we said no. Fast forward a couple months, that same person, I guess, approached us again, and they said, hey, I think they just forgot maybe, and they were like, well, hey, what do you think about that adoption? Remember, we really got to connect you with that birth mother. She's pretty far along by now. And we said, oh my goodness, don't you remember? We talked about how we feel like we couldn't possibly, and people wait years. And he said, oh, rubbish. There's no other people waiting for this child. This child needs a home. Are you going to say yes or no? So of course, if God brings you to this crazy circumstance twice, you say yes. So we, the next day, and it was actually kind of funny, we ended up canceling or delaying our own party for Scott's graduate school graduation.
We just didn't show up to it.
We told some friends, we're like, host everyone for a little bit. We've got somewhere we really have to be. And we met the birth mom, who was so lovely, so brave, so amazing. This 15-year-old girl. And we got into the car after meeting her, and I said, Scott, what do you think? And he said, I think we're going to become parents. So we had 3 months to get a home study, do all of the process of adoption. P.S. We are launching Camp Waitua this summer. So the Lord, I think this is how he speaks to us, is he just says, I'm going to give you all of this stuff, and you have to rely on me because you couldn't possibly do it on your own strength, and it will all work out. So it was a crazy summer, but it did indeed all work out. And Lily Avila Powell was born on September 9th. So we were really so excited to become parents. It's everything we had wanted. I got to be the birth coach. I got to be the first one to hold the baby. These are all adoption blessings that once you're in the adoption world, you think, oh my gosh, you got that? That's amazing. No one gets that. So the Lord showered blessing upon us in that. And we were having lots of sleepless nights, and we were very overwhelmed as parents, trying to figure all of these things out, as all new parents are. And yet we still wanted to ask these questions about what the number 2 baby would look like, not look like, but how the process, I guess, would look. And so we did go to the doctor. We did figure some things out. Meanwhile, we put our names on the list for the adoption agency. And they said, gosh, we have so many families wanting to adopt right now, like we alluded to before. And we are going to have about 12 to 18 months before we can put you on the list that birth parents will look at. And then it will be about 18 to 36 months before you are chosen as parents for,
if ever.
Yeah, you just want to have to be chosen. And so we knew it would be a long road to adoption number 2. And then we found out the devastating news that we would never have a biological child, barring a miracle, which they do happen, but we would never have a biological child. So now adoption was the only route God had for us, again, which was fine, but there was a lot of grieving that had to happen in that, because that's a loss. That is a true loss to not be able to have a biological child. And so we grieved, we had a lot of tears, and a lot of despair. I would say that for me, going into wanting so desperately baby number 2 and knowing that there wasn't much we could do about it other than wait. It was like being in Good Friday, not knowing if there was going to be an Easter Sunday. And that was really hard. So I became a woman obsessed in prayer. Obsessed is a bad word. It makes it sound bad. I prayed, you prayed, we prayed and we prayed and we prayed for baby number 2. We told friends that we were really wanting to adopt, knowing that, you know, that's kind of how our adoption number 1 happened, was talking to friends. And so we wanted to be really open with people about our desire for baby number 2. So when Lily was 2 and 4 months, we get a call that our friends were working with an agency in Florida, and they said, hey, would you like to adopt this baby? He's going to be due in 1 to 3 weeks. We need a family with an active home steady. And they were like, we have a 9-month-old. We're good. And we're also deeply in debt from our last adoption. So we can't say yes, but we have friends who I know are very much wanting to adopt. So,
namely us.
So they called us and they said, are you interested? And I'm alone. Scott's across the country at a conference in Baltimore, right? And I'm on the phone. They're like, are you interested? And I'm like, yes. I mean, let me talk to my husband, but yes. And I knew, because we knew we had an active home study and all of the pieces would be in place for us. So after a lot of excitement and tears of joy on the phone, we put our name forward for baby number 2, have a conversation on the phone like 2 days later, and then 3 days later we were chosen. 3 weeks later, Samuel was born. And Samuel, of course, means God heard, right? And so God heard our prayers. And so we named him Samuel because he heard our prayers for him. Okay, so then we have 2 kids. Everything is honky-dory, right? We got the full house we were hoping for, but it wasn't quite as full as what we were hoping for. And baby number 3 was burning on my heart. But we were pretty busy with the 2 littles for a long time. And there was a lot of things that we didn't expect. And I'm going to talk about more about that in a second. But there was a lot of things that came into our lives that were not what we had hoped for, not what we had expected. That took a lot of our time and energy and spiritual, mental, emotional, everything. But we still felt that desire for another child.
It felt like there was something missing.
Felt like something was missing.
Explain why that would be.
And nothing really was missing.
No.
Like everything we loved our children. Yeah. But something was missing. And it was 6 years. And we felt that God was actually, I really felt like we were supposed to have a 3rd child. And yet he was giving us no permission to put our names with the adoption agency. We kept praying, should we put our name on the agency list? Should we put our name in the agency list? Because these things take years. We should probably get going on it. We felt no permission to put our names on that list. And at the same time, we wanted a 3rd so desperately. And so after 6 years, we said, you know, maybe that's not what God wants for us. Maybe he just wants us to have all of our focus and energy and attention into the family he has already built for us. I'm so sad, but okay. Okay, so we grieved it, we mourned it, we went through actual process here to grieve that loss that we wouldn't have another child. So
I can actually pinpoint the moment. It was just after New Year's, and I'd just gone back to work, and I remember seeing, I think I saw a baby at Mass before that. And that was the first moment it actually became real. It was sort of an abstraction before that. And I thought, oh, yeah, we're never going to have another baby. And that's, there was definitely a moment that I had hoped moment.
Yeah.
And I said, that's done. I guess God's not going to give us that. That's okay. Everything's all right. I had hoped this. And I mentally and sort of spiritually in my heart, I closed the door. And I said, all right, I'm done. I'm walking away from this.
Yeah. And then it's so interesting that you can pinpoint that after New Year's thing, we get a phone call, and it was from the agency that we had worked with for Samuel's adoption. And they had called us saying that there was a baby girl due in 1 to 3 weeks, and the family knew about our family, and they wanted us. They wanted our children to be in that child's life, and they wanted us to be the parents. I couldn't believe it. And we had 1 to 3 weeks to to get ready for baby number 3 and get a home study. And it was so funny. The agency said it was the fastest home study in Colorado history. And we had not been saving up for an adoption. No. We had not been planning this or preparing in any way, shape, or form. We grieved it. We closed the door.
We just got rid of all the baby stuff. We just took it to Goodwill that day.
And so I laugh because it is so joyous, because everyone joined us in that. People we didn't know donated to our adoption fund. We talked to family members, and they dropped off baby stuff, and we had everything that we needed in a matter of 9 days. We had all the money we needed for the adoption. We had all the baby stuff that we needed at that time in 9 days. It was so beautiful how the whole community came together to bring this little girl into our lives. And so Evelyn Luca Powell was born in February of 2017. So now we have these 3 kids that we were so aching for. And I don't know what the rest of our story is going to look like. Just last night, my son was saying, I want a little baby brother. Can we please adopt another baby? And I said, well, bud, God's made it really clear every single adoption, and he will continue to make that so clear.
So what does this have to do with Mary and Cleopas? What does this have to do with the story? Because you look at our family, and we have a beautiful family. We have a blessed family. God has done for our family what is beyond our wildest dreams. And you could look at our family and say, well, that's easy. Everything worked out perfectly. These children needed a home. You guys wanted kids. Bing, bang, boom. Everything's great. Silver linings all around. Right. Everything's cool.
Win-win.
Happily ever after, right? But that's never how it is in the Christian life. It's never simply happily ever after.
And it's not simply win-win. A lot of people will say, oh, well, this is so great. They needed a home. You wanted children. How perfect, how great the Lord works, and how great the Lord does work. But it's important to acknowledge that adoption actually starts as a lose-lose. My kids, our kids, they lost their birth mother. They lost the only home they knew for 9.5 months. They lost the attachment that they had been forming. We lost the chance to keep them safe for those 9 months. We lost the chance to carry them. People ask me how I feel about adoption, and I hate it because they'll say, do you want kids of your own someday? We have kids of our own, very, very much our own. They might not be biologically connected to us, but they are kids of our own, absolutely. But the thing that is hard is that, so I don't need my biology passed down. We don't need our biology passed down, but we missed out on those 9 months. We missed out on the attachment of those 9 months.
And we think of all the things that we would have been doing, and the songs I could have sang, the baby in the womb, and the ways, the nutrition and diet, and all the things that we would have loved to do that we didn't get a chance to have. Those things were taken from us in a certain sense.
And so to grieve that, we did. We grieved that, and we also have a lifetime of complications because of that loss. And adoption is so beautiful, but it does come with it a different path. Someone has said to us once, adoption is like it's exactly the same as raising biological children, and totally different all at the same time. And so that's been a journey for us. And there has been a journey in that of great suffering. Yeah. I would say at times, for stretches of years, tremendous suffering. We don't have to go into details of that, because I'm sure you all know suffering in your marriage, and you all know those moments where you are beyond what you think you can possibly do. I mean, there was even a moment where I heard this whisper, so beautiful, right? My grace is sufficient for you. And I said, Jesus, I don't believe that right now, because this is so hard. Now, I went to confession, talked to the priest, talked a lot about how we don't always feel the grace, we don't always feel the consolation, but that it is very present, and to open ourselves up to that grace every day. And so that is a huge thing, is that even though I doubted it in that moment, I wanted to walk away and say, you are not here for me right now. He was there for us, and he is here for us now.
It's the moments when you feel it's too hard. This is too much. I can't deal with it. Those were hard 9 months that we were not able to care for our children. And it's hard to wrap our brains around that.
Mm-hmm.
But here's where we come back once again to the story.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where Jesus comes into the suffering, this loss of expectations, disappointment in some ways, blessings in other ways. But when he feels the weight of Mary and Cleopas's disappointment, their letdown. What, we had hoped, we're let down, we're giving up, we're throwing in the towel. Jesus doesn't reprimand that. He does reprimand them. He calls them fools for not understanding the scriptures better. But he also enters in and he says, I think one of the most beautiful and simultaneously troubling lines in all of the scriptures. He says, was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? Was it not necessary? And the problem is, I think oftentimes I've done this myself, and I think Christians in general, sometimes we think of God as simply a God of silver linings, right? The world is hard, there's so much suffering, we all carry our baggage and our crosses and our trials, but we have a God who can bring some good out of it. And in the end, maybe there'll be a silver lining at the end. And that is so profoundly too small for God.
Right.
And I don't want to stand before him at the end of my life on Judgment Day and for him to say, well, I know things were really hard, but I brought some good out of it.
Right.
I gave some children some homes, and that's cool. I want God to look at all the trials of our lives, the trials of my children's lives, all of the things that we haven't yet even experienced, and to say, no, Scott, was it not necessary that you should suffer these things so that I can make you into the parents that I designed you to be, so that I can make your children into the saints that I always wanted them to be? Was it not necessary? I didn't show up at the last minute and make everything okay. I was there from the beginning to the end, all the way, blessing and making my will known and done, even through the suffering. I'm struck, I'm amazed. I often go back to the story of the doubting Thomas. If you remember this, after the resurrection, on the same day, or right around here, the Easter story, when Jesus appears to his apostles and he shows them, that he's alive, he's risen from the dead, but Thomas wasn't there. He was someplace else, and he was so disappointed that he missed it. And then Jesus is kind enough to come back to Thomas, and Thomas is like, I don't know if I buy it. This is too much for me. It's too big, and I won't believe until I can stick my hands into your wounds. Which, let's just be honest, that's weird. That's creepy. What's even weirder than Thomas wanting to stick his hands into Jesus' wounds is the fact that the resurrected, glorified, bodies come back from the dead Jesus still has wounds.
Right.
And that's something I think is worth meditating on. Jesus is glorified. He's so glorified. He's walking through walls. He is unrecognizable to some of his closest friends. He's glorified. And in his glorification, he doesn't say, well, I'm going to take those sufferings, those wounds, those injuries, and I'm just going to wipe them away and pretend they never happened. It's like the cross never existed. No, he said, I'm going to take the wounds. I'm going to retain the wounds in my glory to show you that the wounds, the cross, was the means through which I would redeem the world. Was it not necessary that I suffer these things for you? And likewise, was it not necessary, Scott, Annie, all of you, that you suffer those things that we all suffer, whatever it is you're carrying? Was it not necessary so that I could glorify those wounds and I could make my will and my ways known to the world through them? The cross is how we get saints. The cross is how we become saints. There's one concept that I want to introduce to you, which this is a paradigm that when I first learned this, it actually kind of changed everything about Christianity for me, which is a pretty big statement. But there's some terms that show up throughout the New Testament. Paul talks about them, Jesus talks about them, that I never really understood what they meant by this. And Paul will often say things like, well, the rulers and the people of this world don't understand these things, but in the age to come, things will be made clear. So in the Jewish world that Jesus was born into, and the Judaism of the first century in Palestine, there was an understanding about the world. And essentially, Jewish people of the time like to split the whole lifespan of the earth and humanity into two periods, two ages, right? And they said, well, starting with Adam and Eve, we talked about that last time, right? When Adam and Eve sinned, when they broke trust with God, we sometimes call that the fall. And humanity, which was made for all of these four harmonies, to be in relationship with God, with ourselves, with others, with the created world, where we saw those things clearly, breaking trust with God, the original sin made us fall. And it's like humanity, who was existing at this really high state of being, we took a nosedive and we dropped. And that entered in, so said the ancient Jewish people, the present age, or the old age, they sometimes called it. And the present age is marked by sin and death and corruption and fear and all the stuff that we experience all the time. anxiety, chaos. And they said that someday, even though we live in this age of sin and death and corruption, someday God will come. Someday God will come back and he will step into human history and he will set things right. And sin would be forgiven and death would be no more and evil will be vanquished and every tear will be wiped away from every eye. And they said God would come and he would do that, and that would usher in the second age, the age that is to come. Or sometimes they call it the new age, but that means different things for our culture.
Now, yeah.
The age to come. And sometimes you see Jesus and Paul talking in these ways. But the question for us is, okay, if that's the case, where do we live now? Where do we live in 2020? Are we still in the old age of sin and death and corruption and chaos? Or have we entered into the age that is to come? Because Jesus has risen from the dead, has he not? Now, here's what nobody saw coming. And this, I think, is one of the most fascinating things in theology that has ever happened. Everyone expected, all the Jewish people in Jesus' time, and you can see ancient writings in like the Dead Sea Scrolls and other places about this expectation. Everyone thought God would just come and he would fix it and it would be set right and the bad guys would go that way, the good guys would be vindicated and everything would be good. No one expected what actually happened, which was a long turn of the ages, an in-between time. And in 2020, right now, you and I live in the in-between. We live in the middle of the age that was and the age that is to come. And we know that because Jesus did rise from the dead. And when we go to Mass, when we receive Jesus in the Eucharist, we receive the risen, glorified, resurrected Lord, which means we actually get to partake, not in a metaphorical way, not an abstraction. We physically, literally partake in the age that is to come. When we're baptized into the age that is to come. Sometimes theologians call it the already but not yet principle. Right. Jesus has already come. He's already defeated death. He's already conquered sin. He's already made the world right. But it does not yet entirely look like it. Right. We live in the in-between. And the ancient fathers of the church, the saints, they said that when Jesus steps out of the tomb on Easter Sunday, that's when he ushers in the age to come. They compared it to pregnancy oftentimes. Jesus does too. And they said when he rose from the dead on Easter Sunday, it was kind of the moment that the water broke. And if you've ever been pregnant before, which I never have, but if you've been pregnant, once the water breaks, what happens? Well, the birth doesn't come right away. It's not instantly a baby. That's when the labor pains start. That's when the tribulation begins. But it's not tribulation that's leading to death. It's not tribulation leading to destruction. It's tribulation leading to new life. No new life comes into the world without trial. Whether it be biological birth, whether it be adoption, whether it be newness in the Christian life, no new life comes into this world without trial. Yeah. We live in the middle of it. We live in the labor pains when Jesus is actively bringing to bear in the world, bringing to life, bringing to birth the new creation. And we live in it, even though the world around us doesn't look like it, doesn't feel like it. And I'm convinced that most of the New Testament is spent trying to convince the listeners and the hearers that you are an already people. You've already been saved. You've already been freed from your sin. You've already been freed from the fear of death and decay, but it doesn't yet look like it entirely. In other words, your senses are all deceiving you. It seems like evil is rampant. You turn on the news, you listen to the radio, you go on social media, and it seems like everything is lost. One of my biggest pet peeves, and I fall into this pet peeve often, is that Christians often act like we really don't know the end of this story. We act as though we don't know whether good or evil is going to win in the end. Evil might win. We don't know it's like we're watching a movie and we don't know what the ending's going to be. Right. Guys, we know the ending. We know how this one turns out. Jesus wins, period. Yeah. And all that Satan has the power to do in this age, in this moment, is to lie to us, to whisper in our ears and tell us that the world is not what it actually is, to tell us that everything your senses perceive, that's true. And what Jesus has done is not true. And if that doesn't make any sense, I think the best analogy for me is the Eucharist. And every time you go to Mass, what we see with our eyes is a man on an altar holding up what looks for all the world and tastes and smells and feels and sounds, if you were to break it, like bread. But every time you go up to receive the Eucharist, when the priest or the Eucharistic minister says the body of Christ, we all say, Amen, amen, which is the Hebrew word that means I believe. And what we have just said is, oh, this thing that looks and tastes and feels and smells like bread, it's not. I believe that. Amen. And this stuff in the cup that looks and smells and tastes and feels and sounds like wine, yeah, it's not. It's something else. All of your senses are deceiving you. And if you can wrap your brain around saying, I can trust, I can believe that my senses are deceiving me, and that's actually Jesus Christ, because he knows that if we actually saw what we were receiving, can you imagine if you saw
No.
the risen, glorified Lord of the universe and you ate his body? That's, Jesus knows that's too much for us. So he veils himself. He says, bread, you can deal with bread, right? You can handle that.
You can do bread.
We say, okay, yeah, we can handle that. We can handle, if we saw the world in its fullness, if we saw what Jesus had done, I think our brains would explode because it's too much, it's too big, it's too beautiful, it's too profound. So he leaves a veil over our eyes and he says, I need you to trust me and move forward, knowing that what you can see is not the end of it. What you suffer is not the end of it. These wounds in my hands and my feet and my side, that's not the end of it. There is so much more beyond what you can see. And I need you, even in your blindness, to follow after me. Was it not necessary that you do these things for reasons that you haven't even entirely seen yet? But I have, says God. I've seen them. I know them. And they're beyond your wildest dreams.
And I think that in the last few months, we've all encountered this collective suffering. We've all had things that were very different than what we had hoped for. We had hoped our spring to look one way and it looked another. We had hoped summer to look one way and it looked another. I mean, we didn't have Camp Waitua this summer. That was a big change for our family. We had hoped our children would be in school this fall. School is really good for our kids. It's really good for them.
Our oldest daughter, who's starting middle school, had hoped she'd get a locker, which she's been excited about for years. There's, and that's a small one, but it's one of those things.
But when you're 12, that's a big disappointment.
A big deal. It's a letdown.
And for all of us, what are the things that we had hoped for in these last 6 months, but also in these last years of your marriage or in your life? Because I think it's okay, and it's not like reflecting on all these negative things. I think it's okay to say, well, we had hoped for this, but this is what God did. And I like to think about that couple when they're on the road. Jesus walks with them. And they didn't have to, I mean, they could have been like, stranger, see you later. You know, we're going to walk a little faster and a little brisker, and we're going to try to get this guy off our tail. But they allowed him in. They allowed him in. And how can we right now allow Jesus in? How can we allow him into that road of different of lost expectations and disappointment? How can we let him onto that road of disappointment? How can we have our eyes open to his plan? I mean, that's mostly God revealing himself when he chooses, but there's things we can do to make ourselves more receptive, right? And what else can we do to allow God and to see his plan and to just to be in awe of God? So now I look back at suffering that was extensive. We're in a much better place. We've had a lot of doctors and therapists and people. We have a whole health team journeying with us because we had some significant health complications with our children. And I look back now that I'm not in the depths of my suffering and just in some of the hard work now. And I can say, wow, God, I see how you are moving. I see that. But I didn't see that at the time. And I tried to see it, maybe minus that one moment I shared with you, my rock bottom point in that. But it's hard in the depths of suffering. But I challenge all of us at whatever point of the suffering we are in to say, okay, God, where are you in this? And I don't fully understand because we can't fully see with God's eyes. It's like looking through like a little keyhole. Like we get to see this little bit when he reveals everything to us until the end times. And the last day we'll see everything. But in that time, you know, when we're seeing that little glimpse, it's like, wow, God, you are amazing. You are doing this. And even when we can't see anything, even when that keyhole is dark, knowing, trusting, and this is faith and this is Christian hope. Knowing and hoping beyond a shadow of a doubt that that is what God is doing. God is taking our suffering and turning it into something beautiful. Not a silver lining, but he's turning our suffering into something beautiful. For was it not necessary? For was it not necessary that these trials and tribulations should happen so that all of what he does can be done. I love the thought that whatever Jesus took on, he redeemed. He took on suffering, so he redeemed suffering. So for all of us, in whatever stage of suffering we are in now, or have been, or just struggling through in this pandemic, because I know this has been hard for our family. It's hard for our children and their needs. It's hard for us and our needs. It's hard to see the political landscape right now. It's hard to see just people fighting all of the time. But God is in this. We have to allow him on the road. So our questions for you today are, how can we allow God on the road? How can we bring him in? How can we let him join us in that journey? We have some more questions for you too in the discussion packet, but that's our challenge for you. And we wanted to say thank you for allowing us to share our story with you. We're nothing special. We're just
two people on the road trying to figure out our way.
Just like you, we're all in this together. Truly, this incredible, beautiful vocation of marriage and all that encompasses. We all share in the struggles and in the joys, and let us encourage one another on the road, encourage one another on this road, and encourage each other to bring Jesus along with us on the road. So thank you, everybody, and we hope to someday meet you in person and not just over the computer. God bless you.
Thanks.